Hello.
Hello, and welcome to our...
It's like who's going to speak first?
I know.
With my croaky, horrible voice at the moment.
Oh, no.
Janice, it's lovely to have you with a clean voice, and it's lovely to have Sue Cardwell on the show because we have a special show today, don't we?
We do. It's a book club show today, and Sue's got some interesting books to talk about.
How many books are we talking about?
2, 3.
I mean that way. Two.
2 books.
And right now here's Sue with some very special guests.
Thank you, Malcolm and Janice. Yes, it's book club time, one of my favourite times on Our Time. And I have my panel with me today, not my panel, but the Our Time panel of book club people. First of all, we have Tash Turner. Tash is involved in books, been doing it for a long time, reading. And what is your role, Tash?
I'm acting library manager at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, at Prospect.
And Karen, you're a teacher?
Yes.
And an avid reader?
Yes, I am.
What age group are you teaching?
Year 6s, so they're about 11 years old.
Okay, well that'll be interesting because this book kind of almost relates there. And Maria Komnenos, now you're a teacher as well?
Yes, I am.
And been involved in book clubs for a long while as well?
Yes, I have.
All avid readers, and we have some fascinating books to talk about today. The first one was a completely new genre for me. It's called Divergent. Now, Veronica Roth is actually the author. This is the book she's written, and this is the first in a trilogy. This is a young lady who's 24, a young American author, and has taken the world by storm with this book. Apparently it's incredibly popular. I have to say I found it quite challenging, but I'd be interested to talk with you girls about that. And so we'll get right on to it. Divergent, what did you think? You want to start off, Maria?
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading Hunger Games, and then I worked out that there's a new author out with Divergent, and apparently her movie's being made next year, which will be released, and I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed Hunger Games.
Okay, so I haven't read Hunger Games, so you're a step ahead of me there.
Yeah.
And Karen, you're...
Yeah, I read it because Maria recommended it to me.
Yes.
Because I enjoyed the Hunger Games. I read all 3 Hunger Games in 3 days of the school holidays.
Did you really?
One after the other.
Because you really enjoyed them?
Because I wanted to see what happened. And
Yes.
the kids in my class were reading the Hunger Games. They were addicted to them. They were on every desk at reading time. So I wanted to know what the appeal was. And I
Yes.
thought the appeal was the action was just one active event after another. They didn't waste words on flowery descriptions. It was just action-packed. And it was the same with Divergent.
Yes. Yes, I get that. Tash?
And I really love the strong female character.
Yeah.
You know, it's all based around her, and although they're 16, which is a long way from where I am now, it was quite interesting to see the decisions and choices that she makes. And she was actually, I thought, quite strong in her character already for a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I really liked it. But again, I'd read all 3 of them as well. So.
Okay, so maybe we talk a little bit about the plot. This is what we would call a dystopian society, as opposed to utopian. This is a nightmare world, and this is where the sci-fi comes in, and this is where I'm out of my realm, because I go, but that can't happen, that can't happen. Just don't have that creative mind. It's speculative fiction, really, isn't it? It's a world that I couldn't imagine how it could possibly work out. Would you like to explain, Maria, the different factions of the society that these people lived in?
There was different societies. So there was a society that was part of the army, and there was another one that did all the politics, I think it was. Another one that was all into art. Can you help me?
There was candor, which was the
Honesty.
people who were honest. The Divergent meant that you fell into multiple categories, which is where they got the title from.
Okay.
Erudite were the intelligent ones, I think.
Abnegation and dauntless.
Abnegation were the selfless ones who did everything for everybody else.
As I understand it, it came about as a society that decided that the downfall of the world, or world disorder, had come about through mankind's frailty, our weaknesses. So they each elected a particular attribute that they wanted to foster, and this is where I found it unreal, because if you were dauntless, you were brave, and you were nothing else. There was no multifaceted people, and I found that quite difficult to get my head around.
Yeah.
So this is a society where everybody fell into one faction. Very pigeonholed.
Yeah, yeah. That's the one thing I didn't, but I didn't like that about that society, not that I didn't like it about the book.
Yeah,
And going against your family. If you made that choice, if you were tested and had a choice to make about what faction you went into, and you chose other than your family, you were never allowed to speak with your family again. And I thought that was a really harsh reality as well. Because
the main character, just to explain to our viewers, the main character is a young woman who's part of the abnegation faction. So they were completely selfless. Their faction had decided that selfishness was something that was taboo. So they were completely selfless. So they were all very humble people who wore grey clothes, didn't look in mirrors or do anything like that. But she decided that she wanted to be dauntless, in other words, be one of the brave. So she breaks away from her family, leaves the family, and becomes part of this group.
And her brother does as well.
Her brother did. He went into another group. So the family's completely destroyed. I'm going, no, that's not right. Can't do that. But
at 16, you're making those decisions for the rest of your life.
16-year-olds have to do this. So I would love to know what some of the... Have your students have read it?
Not Divergent, but they've read The Hunger Games.
It would be really interesting to see what young people have to say about this.
I think it's just amplified what adolescents have to do at 16 anyway. We ask them to choose a career path at 16. They have to choose their subjects that they're going to need in later life, and we ask them to think about and make those decisions when they're 16. So I don't think it's totally separate from their real lived experiences.
No, fair enough.
And quite often, you know, if we think about religious sects and things like that, they also adhere to certain rules of living, and I think that when kids make their own choices about their religious or spiritual journeys, they often have to break ties with home as well. So I think because it's amplified, that kids can sort of relate to it.
You mentioned, Tash, the development of the character of, was it Trish? She became Trish.
Beatrice
became Trish when she took on a new role. Tell me, Maria, what did you think about how that change came about in her and the development there?
I thought she wanted to break away from her life with home because she was always a bit different from the others. And then, I don't know, she found the adrenaline of being a Dauntless, and it was just like, it was one thing after another. She would just find more and more adrenaline. And
she kind of started to... that was one thing I did enjoy, that you could see her uncovering her own intrinsic nature, the dauntless side of it, and the bravery that came out of it, where she'd been so subjugated for such a long time.
And then that they're thrown into it straight away, like the first test is jumping on a moving train off the end of a building sort of thing, straight into this big hole, and that's your first test to see if you can actually be part of that faction.
Exactly.
And then to find out that it's only the top 10 that make it into the faction, and the rest become
factionless.
Sort of, which is sort of like homeless people. Then they're not loved by anybody really.
I think the hard part for me was to see that as young people, that their natural instincts had to be sublimated completely, and that there was just that one virtue, bravery or intelligence or whatever, that they had to foster.
But that she was divergent, and she had those three main traits that shone through, and she had to make the choice between the three.
So our advice to grandparents and parents watching?
Yep, if you want to be up to date with teenagers, that's a book to read, because the movie is out next year in March.
And all the young ones will be reading it. Divergent, and it's a trilogy, so grab hold of it. And that's the second one, Insurgent. So it'll be a good one to have a look at. And we'll be back just after the break with our next book, which is The Hours. This is Book Club on Our Time, and I have with me three guests, Tash, Karen and Maria, and we're discussing books that we've been reading and talking about, and hoping that you might enjoy reading them too, and maybe giving you some books that you might enjoy. The second one we're going to look at today is this book called The Hours, which was interesting, very interesting, written by Michael Cunningham, and you can, if you want to have a look at books, you can find them on Goodreads. This is the book, The Hours, Michael Cunningham. The book won the Pulitzer Prize and has been made into a movie with Meryl Streep, Nicole Kidman and Julianne Moore. Come to me, Julianne Moore. I didn't see the movie, but I'm told it was it won some Academy Awards, so it was quite a good film. So tell me about The Hours, Maria.
The first time I read it, I didn't like it,
Yes.
and I didn't know what the book was about, but I read it the second time, and that's when I enjoyed it a bit more.
Okay.
And then when you watch the movie, it puts everything together, and it was an okay book to read.
Okay, Karen?
Well, after I read it, I was thinking, what actually happened in it? One person goes and buys flowers. That's the entire story.
That's why we read it, and it made sense.
And so what it is a lot of their internal kind of
Yes.
construction of the world.
Yes,
But
yeah.
what actually physically happens is quite minimal.
Tash?
Well, I ended up reading that he talks about Mrs. Dalloway is one of the characters in there, and knowing that Virginia Woolf was also in the novel, I attempted to read Mrs. Dalloway as well.
Oh.
And found in the editor's notes that The Hours was the working title for Mrs. Dalloway.
Is that right?
So that's where that tie-in is. But I struggled with it, and I persevered because I knew we would be talking about it.
Yeah.
And when I got to the end, I thought, well, I'm glad I read it because now I understand there's a nice little twist and it sort of ties everything together nicely. But I found it a really hard slog, and the sentences that sort of seem to go on forever.
Yeah.
And then when I read Mrs. Dalloway, I went, okay, that's why, because he's writing in that style, and Mrs. Dalloway was Virginia Woolf, just, I don't know if she was on drugs.
Do you know,
Just went on.
your experience was exactly the same as mine. I mean,
Okay.
yes, it was beautifully written.
Yeah.
And I was enjoying
That's
that, but I
what
was
Karen
thinking,
said.
what the, where are we, who would, but I realised later, I mean, this is one day. It all happens in one day. So it's the lives of 3 different people, 3 different characters, seen through a prism of a single day,
Yep.
reduced to that. And where you can get very confused, because we're talking about, it starts off with Virginia Woolf, who takes her own life in that first segment, but then it's her life later on. So that was just the prologue, I guess. And then the second one was, who was it? Laura Brown. That's right, 1949,
That's
another
right.
young woman. And the third one, Clarissa Vaughan, who was a Mrs. Dalloway-esque type of person.
Well, that was her. She was Clarissa, and the
Clarissa Vaughan.
Richard
Yeah.
nicknamed her Mrs. Dalloway.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
And I think the segue was that Laura was reading Mrs. Dalloway.
Yes.
And then you find out later on that there's a connection between those final characters and Laura, but I won't say any more than that.
Because I didn't get to the end.
Okay.
I ran out of time. I thought it was an interesting thing, and whether it's a relevant comment, that the 3 women all had, in terms of sexuality, were either of lesbian persuasion or they were bisexual.
Yep.
And I think that went right back to the Virginia Woolf one, who was very much a feminist. I don't know about her sexuality, but...
Apparently there were rumours that she was.
Okay. Very much a feminist, and quite an unusual author in that era of the, what was it, late 1929?
1929.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1929.
1929. But I think she died in 1942 around that.
That's right,
But she was born before the turn of the century.
Yeah.
So it was quite some time before that.
So it was 1923.
Yeah.
But it's not like in those days it wasn't unheard of, you know, and
No.
especially in the literary set. But I think it was still one of those things that was very taboo, and so, you know, she wouldn't have come out in any way, shape or form, and maybe she was struggling with those, you know, that inner turmoil with who she was, and maybe that's why she took her own life, because she just couldn't cope with it.
Yeah. But then to see the difference in acceptance of the sexuality through the different generations, I thought was an interesting thing by the time we got to the Laura Brown one.
But and then Clarissa's daughter was gay as well. I thought, you know, okay, so every character in the book is going to be gay, just about. You know, that was quite interesting. But it was a little bit sad that quite a few of the characters died in the book as well. That was a bit morbid. I thought.
Yeah.
You know.
I want to talk to you about the style of writing, which, as I understand, was very much the Virginia Woolf style. That sort of stream of consciousness, if you like, narrative style, whereby what happens in everyday life is all interpreted through memories. How did you find that, Karen? Did you find that an interesting style that grabbed you?
I tried to read Virginia Woolf as well, and I just found those run-on sentences really difficult. And when I did read Virginia Woolf, I did get lost in the sentence, whereas I think Michael Cunningham takes you on a journey and then comes back circuitously to where he started, and it's very tight and controlled and beautiful. Whereas with Virginia Woolf, when I was reading it, I would just get completely lost in the sentence, even though what she was describing and the way she creates this internal world is also quite beautiful. But yeah, I get lost in it.
Mm. Maria?
I tried to read Miss Dalloway as well, and I got up to page 30 and it was like, I don't know where it's going. I couldn't read it, so I put it down.
I was like that with the Hours. I was going, what?
I was like that with the Hours as well, but the first time I read it, it was like, what has happened in this book? So I read it a second time, and that's when it all fell into place. So I took 2 attempts to do it.
Yeah.
So you almost have to change the way you breathe, because you're used to breathing in a full stop, but you can't breathe because it's another comma and another comma.
And language is beautiful. The descriptive work was, there was one where, I think it was when Clarissa Vaughan walked out of her apartment, and the way he was describing the leaves and the trees and the ground, and I just felt, it just had me. That's what kept me going, the language. But I was reading the language thinking how lovely, and then thinking, but hang on, what am I reading about? So if you appreciate good language and literature, I guess that's an interesting side of it.
That was one book that you could actually watch the film and it all made sense again. So as soon as I finished it the second time, I watched the movie and I was going, oh, that's why that happened.
So maybe I need to get the book. So what would we advise our viewers, to get the book or to see the film first and then read the book?
Always read the book first.
Yeah, always definitely read the book first. But I think with this one, if you're prepared to read it twice, you'll get the full benefit.
And it's not
of
a
it,
huge book. I mean, it doesn't take a long time to read.
Big.
So if you've got the time, it's a good one. This is called The Hours. It's written by Michael Cunningham, a Pulitzer Prize winner. An interesting book to read. So I challenge you. Give it a look and see what you think. And we've got some more to talk about, and we'll be back very shortly. We've still been talking about the hours between the four of us, about some of the things that came up. Karen was just discussing this whole issue of the sexuality. We mentioned that all the 3 characters all were either bisexual or they were lesbians. And it's an interesting thread that goes right through the 3 of them, doesn't it, over generations?
I was interested the way that Virginia Woolf struggled. She had a real internal struggle, and it was really obvious in the Hours.